Hello, everyone, and welcome to our third live streamed presentation for the 2020 Archives Bazaar. I am delighted to introduce our next presenter, Dr. Alison Rose Jefferson, a historian and heritage conservation consultant based here in Los Angeles, who will tell us about her recently published book, Living the California Dream, African American Leisure Sites During the Jim Crow Era. Dr. Jefferson will be joined by USC Professor Bill Deverell, a widely published historian of the American West, and they will engage in what is sure to be a fascinating conversation about Dr. Jefferson's process of gathering information for her book from formal archives, private collections, and oral histories. There will be time for questions at the end of this conversation, and you should use the Q&A button to submit questions and comments. And please feel free to submit those questions and comments before the end of the presentation. So over to you, Dr. Jefferson and Dr. Deverell.
It's great to be here. It's great to be here. Alison, congratulations on this book. Really looking forward to your presentation, and then you and I can chat with one another and then take questions from those that are with us. But just wonderful news about the publication of the book, and I'm just excited to hear what you have to say about it.
Well, you did kind of help out with it. And we'll talk about that later.
Okay, all right, great.
Thanks so much to the Archives Bazaar and Suzanne for inviting me to participate in the program today. Could you put the first slide up, please? Okay. African Americans began moving in large numbers to the Los Angeles environs in the decades surrounding the turn of the 20th century, joining a multi-ethnic community that included whites and people of color, as well as immigrants of many national backgrounds. The majority of new Black migrants relocated from American southern states. Their stories are about public and private memories of African Americans of all socioeconomic classes, the new Negroes who migrated to United States northern, Midwestern, and far western parts in the post-war World War I decades to escape the worst of Jim Crow era racist, anti-Black restrictions, and racial injustice. These migrants were more self-confident and sometimes militant in demanding their rights as citizens and consumers. Next slide, please. Similar to other groups who moved to the state, African Americans also embraced the recurring booster promoted California dream of a leisure lifestyle as a permanent way of life in picturesque outdoor settings, a mild climate, new life opportunities, even while discrimination and lax enforcement of California's civil rights laws that were established as early as 1893 many times prevented them from using various public and private facilities and buying land in many areas for decades into the 20th century. In my new book, Living the California Dream, African American Leisure Sites During the Jim Crow Era, I explore how African Americans made California and American history by challenging racial and class structure when they occupied recreational sites and claimed public space at the core of the state's formative mid-20th century identity. These places became sites of resistance in the development of attractive inland and beach, inland resorts and beaches relatively free from white citizens' harassment. In Los Angeles, recreation and relaxation were an essential component, were essential components of liberty and distinctive civil concerns in the nation's long freedom rights struggle. Next slide, please. I offer a view of the overlooked, extraordinary community builders and socioeconomic development experiences of Black middle-class people of Los Angeles and California, and the impact of leisure that intersects with the new scholarship about the influence of the diverse output of the Harlem Renaissance and the new Negro experience as a cultural movement of national and global phenomena. These stories of unrecognized voices, economic development initiatives, and civil rights struggles add new information and understanding about how African Americans sought to seize their Californian American dreams to appropriate and shape the offerings of their new environment in the far West. These stories I have reconstructed in the book. I found through archival, personal collections, oral history, and site visit research. And all of these stories are recast the significance and meaning and place of leisure by recognizing African Americans' leadership and action, therefore giving a more complex understanding of the American experience and identity in the West and California, where racial discrimination existed in practice rather than legal prescription, as in many other states of the nation in the post-enslavement modern capitalist era. Next slide, please. In contrast to the city where Black Angelenos lived, California waterfront and inland pastoral places where they went to relax and invest in real estate included in Los Angeles County, Bruce's Beach in Manhattan Beach, Santa Monica's Bay Street Beach area, sometimes controversially called the Inkwell, and Eureka Villa in the Santa Clarita area in North Los Angeles County. Lake Elsinore and Corona's Park Ridge Country Club in Riverside County were other locations, and there's a few other places that I talk about as well in the book. These stories of California's largest and most popular, though not broadly remembered, African-American relaxation destinations were sites of pleasure, identity, challenge to racist and anti-Black public policies and private practices, and economic development that flourished for different time durations between the 1900s to the 1960s. Next slide, please. Race, power, privilege, and wealth often influenced and restricted leisure opportunities, just as these factors determine who was able to take advantage of economic and social opportunities in Southern California. Even with these impacts, African Americans in their building and enjoyment of these leisure communities through creative assertion claimed and performed full humanity, civic membership, economic and social development, resourcefulness, and self-determination. Next slide, please. This history is layered with stories about group and individual circumstances and chronicles about migration patterns, socioeconomic status, cultural practices, and education and employment opportunities, as well as social power. These multifaceted, intersecting, and overlapping experiences and stories took place in private and public spaces. they are inseparable from one another in their composition and reflection of the structural racial exclusion and class exploitation imposed on African Americans and other people of color. Next slide, please. At these places in California and around the US, the African American experience and memory of these spaces and the attention they gained in newspapers of the era aided in creating public memories, created public memory that offered African Americans new, broader visions of themselves, a new identity, and new collective sense of freedom and humanity, contributing to cultural and intellectual efforts that define the new Negro. In Southern California, African Americans' ambitions and initiatives for leisure space also radically claimed, challenged, and promoted the region's identity in the consumption of leisure as a lifestyle that would spread across the country to develop a new suburban middle-class culture. Next slide, please. Black Angelenos challenged the era's white supremacist conventions about social space as they asserted self-determination to participate in popular leisure and resort cultural, social, and economic trends that were considered modern by the 1920s. In ex-urban communities, African Americans bought property so they could control their enjoyment of these activities and contest anti-Black racism. Particularly, they were challenging prejudice and power of whites in the labeling of African Americans as laborers and as inferior. Next slide, please. Each site discussed in the book has its own history of the development of leisure of a specific sort in social, political, and economic particulars, as well as racialized issues of the time and place. This and other Southern California, these and other Southern California leisure spaces mark an African American identity on the regional landscape and social space as they confronted the emergent power politics of leisure, the emergent power politics of leisure space. The stage was set for these sites as places for remembrance of invention and public contest. Next slide, please. Fast forward, important recent occurrences in Santa Monica have taken place, with the African American beach site being listed in 2019 as the Bay Street Beach Historic District on the National Register of Historic Places by the National Park Service for its significance in the Black experience in US history. This is the first historical district in Santa Monica to receive this national honor. Since 2012, I have led initiative, I've led initiatives, but I've led innovative public programming partnerships in Santa Monica with nonprofit groups and government entities to engage people in learning about more complex, culturally inclusive stories of our collective national history and the African American experience, heritage conservation issues, beach wildlife appreciation and stewardship, and aspirations to environmental justice in public policy involving beach access and civic action with Nick Gavaldon Day, International Coastal Cleanup Day, and field trips for youngsters from South Los Angeles, and the new Belmar History Plus Art Project, which will debut very soon. Some of these programming efforts include an introductory surfing lesson as part of the beach recreation experience. Next slide, please. Oh, I gotta go back a slide. Go back a slide, please. So also in contemporary times, new energy has reclaimed the important marginalized California ocean line history on it has reclaimed the ocean line history of African American places of enjoyment, freedom struggle, and community and economic development sabotaged during the Jim Crow era. At Bruce's Beach in Manhattan Beach and the Bay Street Beach in Santa Monica, they have become sites of conscience and reflection for memorial and celebratory events at this time in 2020, when systematic racial inequalities have been laid bare by the long history of injustice that has led to the death of several African Americans and other people of color. Events held at these sites show solidarity with the nationwide protests against systematic anti-Black racism and police brutality, which the Black Lives Matter movement has forced prominently onto the national agenda as part of a reclamation of and commitment to the Black freedom struggle. Okay, you can, next slide, please. Like many whites and Black Americans who were lured to California for its opportunities and good life imagery produced by writers, painters, photographers, and movie makers, which were used by various boosters promoting migration to the state. The stories and imagery of African Americans who participated in various, got confused there. So what I was saying is that Black people and white people and everybody else who came to California were lured by all the good life imagery that was produced by various boosters promoting migration to the state. The stories and imagery of African Americans who participated in various phases of the Western migration and settlement continue to remain largely absent from the dominant mythologies and histories surrounding the Western migration, notwithstanding investigation of the Black West published in the last 50 years. Next slide, please. Today, I have briefly highlighted little known stories about African American leadership and socioeconomic investment in the California dream lifestyle and what have been called frontier of leisure destinations in Southern California from the 1900s to the 1960s. And a few ways the history is being reclaimed now. Next slide, please. After my presentation and the conversation that Bill and I are going to have today, I hope that all of you will take time to learn a little bit more about these forgotten Black Westerners and their undertakings. And I hope you'll pick up my book, Living the California Dream, African American Leisure Sites During the Jim Crow Era. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alison. Your work really is a big corrective to so much about California and Western history that does have these large gaps, and just bundles of congratulations to you for bringing it out. I want to ask a couple of specific questions that your remarks have provoked, and then we'll back out to some more general questions about your conception of the work and how you did it. So you used this phrase early on in your presentation about performing site visit research, and then those maps were terrific. Tell us a little bit about doing that site visit research. What did you find in terms of remnants or even actual revelations about these sites of African American leisure? Where'd you go and what'd you find?
Well, each of the places that I cover in my book has a different kind of configuration. So for instance, at Lake Elsinore, one goes out there and the urban footprint of the African American community in terms of the street plans and what have you is still there. But in terms of who lived there and who had resort businesses, all of those are gone. But you can feel the community in terms of where everyone lived. There was this particular street, Pottery Street, where most of the African Americans lived, and it was at the outskirts of the town area, and it was where one of the early hotels was, and now there's a apartment building there, and there's a park next to it, and that park is named after an African American who was the first. He was the mayor there, and he was the first African American city councilman there in Lake Elsinore, and one of the first African American city council people in California. And he got on the council in the 1950s. And so geographically, I could understand how the community was set up. I could understand where the lake was. I could understand where, for instance, one of the beach areas there that African Americans had their resort was Lakeshore Beach, and I talk about that in the book. I could understand where that was in relationship to where the community was living and where the businesses were that supported them going to that beach area, which had its own business there. So it was just interesting to get the spatial dynamics there of everything in terms of how people would interact, where the main street is, that kind of thing. And then going to Corona, which is up the way from Lake Elsinore off the 15, well, there's no remnants of the country club that African Americans bought, but going there and seeing the hills and what have you was really interesting, because reading about it, they talk about, oh, they burned a cross on the hill across the way to scare the African Americans who purchased this white country club from continuing to inhabit the place. So just understanding, knowing that the freeways are running through there right now, and that's changed some of the dynamics of what those hills look like, but just getting a sense of, you know, that space and kind of vibing about, well, what was it that was attractive to people about going to these places, or what maybe was attractive for some people and not attractive for others? Because I know in terms of my research, some of the people that I interviewed, they went out to Lake Elsinore a few times, and they're like, oh, it was too hot out there, and the water smelled like sulfur. And so, you know, it's just interesting to think about those things. And then Val Verde in northern LA County, that was laid out as a developed community for African Americans. And so it has city-sized lots. You're driving up into this narrow canyon and just kind of getting, and you're in this canyon. So you're getting a sense of place and what was viscerally the experience that people would have. One person I interviewed in my book, Renee Marie Rogers. So she remembers going up there as a kid, and the thing that she remembers about being there is driving into the valley and smelling the barbecue, and then also smelling the trees, the different trees that were up there, and how that whole experience impacted her life later as an adult. And now she's a boater, she rides horses, she's got 50 different chickens at her house, rescue chickens, and her father was a lifeguard at the pool at Val Verde. So just those experiences for her of that space and what have you, when she told me those things and I visited it, I kind of thought about that.
Yeah, I can understand. I mean, it sounds a little haunting in a way, and just given your knowledge of these places, just to go and see remnants or just the feeling, I think it reminds us that not all archives are in manuscript boxes or on stacks in special collections. You know, the archive can be the place itself, and just going there and getting a sense of it, it's obviously going to enrich the book, and all those sensory, you know, even your gestures, as you were just answering the question, the sensory power of these places is still something you want to reveal. One more specific question that your presentation provoked. One of your slides has a credit line to the Cosmos Club Archive. What is that?
So the Cosmos Club is an African-American social club that was started in the 1940s, men's club, and they are still meeting today, and they have a couple of fabulous photo album books that I was able to access. And that's
fabulous.
I don't know what they're going to do with it, but you know, I'm kind of, you know, around, and I may encourage them to do something with it. But they did let me, you know, use a few pictures.
That's amazing. So Alison, I think as long as we've known one another, you have been wanting to do this book, and you've worked many years on putting this book together, and now it's come to be. What gave you the idea in the first place to go to sites of leisure as a way to gauge culture?
So I started out in the I was in a program at USC, and I took a class with Bill Deverell and with the late Kevin Starr, and I was looking around for a paper topic initially in Kevin Starr's California history class. And I had presented him the idea of these leisure sites, and also another idea of looking at Frank Miller as a modern day boutique hoteler, comparing him to modern day boutique hotelers. And with the leisure sites, I had some experience with it because my mother's family moved here in the 1920s, and my mother and her brothers and my grandparents used to go to Lake Elsinore. And my mom used to talk about this experience to me when she was when she was alive. And so I was always just kind of curious. And so I didn't really have a lot of information about it when I decided I wanted to do the paper, and I kind of found out more about these other sites, and I presented it to Kevin, and he was like, "Oh yes, do this. Don't do that other paper on Frank Miller." He says, "Everybody's written on that, but these leisure sites, I don't know anything about them, and I don't think many other people do." And so that was kind of, you know, it was something I was interested in, and I was encouraged to pursue it. And at that point in time, I didn't know I was going to go on and get a PhD. And then I took a class from Bill Deverell, a seminar on California history. And I realized in that class that there wasn't a whole lot on African Americans in California or Los Angeles, for that matter. And Doug Flaming his book had just come out, and he actually came to do a talk at USC, and there was a book signing for him, and he came to our class. And so, you know, it was, and my family is not mentioned in his book, but they were certainly around during the era that he was writing about, Bound for Freedom, pre-World War II. And some of the people that he wrote about, I knew a lot about, just from family experience. And then as I have grown as a historian, I've learned about them from a research standpoint. So it started out as something that I'm interested in my family connections to Los Angeles and their Great Migration participation, because they were the embodiment of the Great Migration,
Exactly.
and what have you.
Yeah, no, I think that mixture of family and educational training and region and generations of stories and your mom, it all has sort of flowed together so well in terms of urging you really to write this kind of book. And your mention of Doug Fleming reminds me that that talk that you reference about Doug, that's the very first event that the Institute on California in the West ever had. So it goes back to the start of that. And I think that's, of course, about the time you and I started to know one another. Let me ask you, I think one of the things about your work that I really admire a great deal is you're writing about leisure. And the images that you've shown us today are really tantalizing because people are enjoying themselves. And you're writing about recreation, and you're writing about getting away from the cares of the world. And yet, of course, this is a period of deep Jim Crow discrimination and worse. This is a period saddled with the memories of the really quite recent enslavement and Civil War period. So how do you find the balance between, I'm going to write about these places where people are clearly enjoying themselves and they're really palpable for that, but I'm not going to lose track of the deep hurts and heartaches and oppression on that landscape by way of race? How do you navigate those two?
Well, you just write about both of them. I mean, from my standpoint, I mean, that's part of the Black experience. And one day you may have had a bad experience, and the next day you are out there struggling again to make things better for yourself and your family and your community, and you just keep rolling. You're not struggling all the time. You have a few days where you have some good times, and I think sometimes people forget that Black people do have a full humanity, and so I try to express that full humanity in terms of what I'm writing about, and I think sometimes that's what's lacking in some writings, because some people have gotten very narrow in terms of looking at some of the social issues rather than looking at the broader human issues. I had somebody recently say to me, I'm working on an exhibit project in Santa Monica, the Belmar History Plus Art Project. It's a public history project, and we are going to have an outdoor exhibit with 16 different panels that'll have history of the African American community in South Santa Monica and a big public sculpture. Well, somebody was looking at this picture of these people on the beach. I have it in my slides that I showed today, I think. And they are in front of a sign that says Casa del Mar. Well, they look like they're having a good time, and they're in front of this sign that says Casa del Mar, and they were excluded from going on the other side of the sign that's on the fence, okay? But they're still having a good time. And this person was a well-meaning person who was not African-American, said, well, they don't look like they're oppressed. And I was like, well, just because they're there, that doesn't mean that they can't have a good time, even though they're having problems in terms of the fact that they can't go on the other side of that fence. They're making a space for themselves for enjoyment within the context of their time and space.
Yeah, that's an excellent answer to my question. So thank you for that. When you showed us that newspaper ad for these sites, and you had marked out this place or that place or that place, if you were to scroll up the Eagle or the Sentinel now in those want ads, are there some places that might pop out that you haven't heard of? I mean, are there still some mysteries to this recreation and leisure landscape in terms of the institutions that were advertising themselves to the African American community?
Not on the scale that I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
I think that I and others have mined them. There's another Jennifer, I can't think of her last name right now, but she did her dissertation on Murray's Dude Ranch out in Apple Valley. And that was a place that African Americans went. And I didn't do anything about that in my book because I knew she was writing about it. And so she was closer out there. My first paper, I did something on it, but not the book. And so, I mean, I'm looking forward to reading what she's talking about with that space. There was a place in Watts that hasn't gotten a lot of coverage, but we know it was there, Leaks Lake. And that was in the lowlands of Watts in the early part of the 20th century, and it's been paved over and houses and what have you on that. And so that had a little more personality to it than we have been able to find. And then the other places didn't last very long. They just kind of were attempts at development, and I mentioned several of them in my book. And then there were a couple that, for instance, the Pacific Beach Club that was in Huntington Beach, they built this beautiful facility, and Dan Cady has done work on that beautiful facility, and I talk about it as well. And it was burned to the ground right before it was to open in 25. And so with that, what we can say is that, for instance, in Huntington Beach, there were some African Americans that were living down there. And so that means that some of those stories would be interesting to know about in terms of living in those areas.
Well, I think what's going to happen, if it hasn't happened already, as people become more familiar with your book and your sources and your archives, you're going to get people reaching out to you saying, you know, I've got this scrapbook, or grandma's got something in her attic, or, you know, under the bed are a series of clippings about our lives. So I think, you know, the book is going to do that kind of work too, which is more material is going to come to light, and it probably already has.
So as you were saying that, this morning,
we didn't plan this.
This morning, Sonia Reese Greenland, who is a descendant of Arthur Reese, who is one of the early African Americans who lived in Venice. And he worked with Abbott Kinney's businesses and his own businesses. And she's provided me with a lot of information. He was involved in Lake Elsinore. I talk about him in the book. She called me this morning. She says, oh, I found a picture of Walter Gordon. It's a portrait of him. And he was a business owner in Santa Monica in the first decade of the 20th century. He moved here from Mississippi. I have a picture of people standing out in front of his business, but I didn't have a picture of him. She found a portrait of him, and it must be from like around 1920. She texted it to me this morning. So yeah.
Fabulous.
And then another, this is a great story. There are the Preludes, are a family that owned property in Manhattan Beach. Their descendants have been here. I didn't know they were here. I couldn't find them because they were children in the 20s. Well, once some of the stories came out, then they came out and they knew people that I knew, and they were like, oh, I'm so sorry, I never introduced you. And we have found a few interesting artifacts from those people. So what Bill is saying is, it is happening.
That's so exciting. Well, I do have a couple more questions, but I want to turn to Susie, our colleague and friend, and see where we are with the program moving forward to Q&A from others as well.
It looks like we have a few questions. So Bill, if you want to ask one more and then we can move on to these questions, or
Sure. So it's I think it's a question that you could probably elaborate on it for a while, Alison, but we probably don't want to do that, just to give the audience a chance. Just tell us really quickly how you see your training in heritage conservation and your training in doctoral history. How do they work together on this book?
So I was able to build on the experience that I had starting out in heritage conservation in the master's program, in the PhD program. And I went into the PhD program because I wanted a broader platform to work from. In heritage conservation, In the United States, it's really more historic preservation, and it's talking about stories about people through the built environment. And sometimes the stories that I am interested in don't relate to the built environment from the standpoint of a building. It might be place, and it might be experiences at place, but the building may not be significant. It's not an artifact of architecture. It's an artifact of social history that went on in the building. So I got a broader platform. Also, because I started out in heritage conservation in terms of research, I think that helped me to think about research in a broader way than had I started out straight in an academic program. Because in historic preservation, we're using a much wider variety of documents to make our case, and sometimes just snippets of documents. So we're using public records, we're using building permits, we're looking at oral histories, we're looking at architecture history, sometimes social history, depending on who's doing the examination of the information for this particular building site. So I think that was helpful. And also I think because I had also come to getting the PhD after having some other work experience with research, that I had a broader kind of perspective about research, and I wasn't as hung up on the archives as some of my other colleagues might be. Sorry about that, but.
I get it. I get it. I think that's a good answer. Yeah. Susie.
Okay, we have a few really great questions here. One is, I think this is a very interesting one. Can you talk about the text on the sign at Bruce's Beach? What would you like removed from that text?
Well, first off, that text is inaccurate, and it's also, and it also dilutes the importance of, I'm sorry, I have some work going on. I have to say something for these people. I'll be with you in a minute. Sorry, folks. I told them I could only talk to them at my breaks. So anyway, in terms of that plaque, it needs to be rewritten to recognize the appropriate, the actual story. First off, George Peck's name needs to be taken out of the top of it because it's promoting the white person there as the hegemonic, as the leader of all of this, and saying that he is the one that allowed these Black people to develop their resort, which isn't true. He didn't sell them the property. Well, he didn't put covenants on the property, but he didn't put covenants on the property. He didn't anticipate Black people wanting to be down there. And also, at the time in 1912, nobody really wanted to come down there. They didn't have the train. They didn't have, it was still dirt roads. So he was trying to sell to whoever he could, but it just happened that some Black people came down there and they had the money, and this real estate agent, Willard, sold them the property. And they had a very successful business down there. So with that, they need to recognize the Bruces, and then the swim in that occurred, the early civil rights activity down there at the first of the NAACP in the region needs to be recognized on that plaque as well. And then there's some other things that should go on there and be taken off. But that's not a conversation to have in just this short time. It needs to be thought out. It needs to be thought out. So whoever asked that question, don't be taking what I said as, you know, how the plaque should go. It needs to be thought out. And people like myself need to be consulted. People like Bill need to be consulted to help the city and the residents down there figure out how to structure what's going to be in that label. Okay. And then they'll get out of the problem that they're in right now.
Thank you. I think we'll have time for maybe 2 more questions. The May 1948 cover of Ebony featured a Black woman and a white woman sunbathing on a boat in Lake Elsinore. At that time, Lake Elsinore was also one of the few beaches where Jews were allowed. Oops, excuse me. How integrated was Lake Elsinore? Were there Black only and whites only sections, as in beaches in Santa Monica, Manhattan Beach, and elsewhere?
Those were two Black women on the cover of Ebony. It wasn't a Black and a white woman. Now, she may have been a woman who was of the lighter complexion, who was African American, but you know, she was culturally African American. So there was a Jewish area there at Lake Elsinore. The beaches, there was a public beach, and generally that was where African Americans would go, or they would go to Lakeshore Beach. And Lakeshore Beach was the area that African Americans owned there, and what have you. And in terms of the white folks that were there, they weren't necessarily all that happy that the Black people were there when they came in large numbers and they had their free time and they were doing what they wanted to do. They weren't working for people, so therefore the white people couldn't control them. One of the reasons why that community was able to even have this resort was when the town was founded, and I talk about this in the book, there was an African American family that was there, and it was Quakers that founded the town. So with that, that helped to set the tone for who was going to live there. And also the Herd group, they wanted to have, they structured their subdivision so that it could be more affordable for a wider variety of people. They didn't want just it to be estates. And part of that had to do with the time period of which they were developing the land. More and more people were coming here of more diverse economic circumstances. So they wanted to make sure they could capitalize on whoever was coming to sell their land. And if you've got big swaths of land, then, you know, regular folks aren't going to buy that. The Wrigleys might buy it, and Amy Semple McPherson might buy it, but Joe and Dorothy Thomas from Wyoming or from Mississippi, they may not be able to afford that. They could afford a few acres, but they can't afford 20 acres.
Okay, one last quick question. I'm sorry we can't get to all of them. I'm trying to go in order here. Which regional archives did you find most helpful in researching your book?
That's not a question to ask, because each of the chapters that I did my book on, each of them had different resources that I used. And there are a few that overlapped, and that would be and I'm not saying it was the most useful, but an overlapping archive would be the LA Public Library Shades of LA collection, photographs, okay? In terms of materials that I used, in terms of textual materials, those came from all over the place. So for instance, one great thing about the chapter on the Park Ridge Country Club, they wrote about it in the local papers out there, the local newspapers. So I was able to go through the local newspapers in the 1920s and get the full story from their perspective out there of what went on, okay? They wrote about it a little bit in the Black papers in Los Angeles, but not in the same way that the white papers in Corona wrote about it. And then in terms of, and those papers are in the Corona Public Library, okay? And then in terms of Santa Monica, I got that, a lot of oral histories from people led me to information in different places. The library there didn't have anything. Mostly with Santa Monica, I was finding resources from individuals and crafting the narrative interspersed with what I might find in the newspaper. And that would be how I would say. And census records for this work, oh, amazing. Amazon, Ancestry.com can be an amazing resource. You can find out a lot of stuff on Ancestry.com, and sometimes people don't give it credit for, you know, what's there, because you can triangulate stuff from what you're reading in terms of the census information on people. I mean, one person, this woman who had a hair salon, which I talk about in my new project in Santa Monica, her family says that her business was in one location. Well, when I went back through the census records and I went back through the directories, I found it in another place. I never found it in the place where the family says it was. But I, you know, in my narrative, I say, well, this is where I found it. And then it could have also been at this other place because she had it in her house when she first started. Then she went to the place where I found her in the directory. And then maybe she was also at the place that the family said she was at, but it's not in the directories that I've been able to find the information. So, you know, I triangulated all that, okay? Like I couldn't get from the family, where did she come from? Well, I got it from the census record. Where did her husband come from? I got it from the census record. What was his employment? I got it from the census record.
Great. Well, thank you so very much, Dr. Jefferson, for sharing your research with us today. This was really a wonderful presentation, and thank you, Dr. Deverell, for being such a great partner in this conversation and asking such wonderful questions. We can't thank you enough for joining us today, and we hope to have you back again at a future Archives Bazaar. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.